In today's new episode of Missing, we speak with old friend Ross Griffiths, the archives librarian from Worcester State. And we also speak with new friend Joseph Citro, the folklorist and author from Vermont. The topic is the Bennington Triangle. Lance, I absolutely loved this conversation. What did you think?
I loved it too, and I'm smiling over here because it's so good to hear new friend Joseph Citro. When we started doing this Bennington Triangle story with Ross, we had brought Joseph's name up into the conversation because he's a legend. And it was just amazing to have this future legend in Ross on and this current legend in Joe Citro on to talk about something that we've been covering for months now. It's the story that won't go away, thankfully, because every conversation we have reveals something new and leads us to a further conversation that just gets better and better. So yeah, I loved this, and I think the listeners are going to really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I really hope so because, yeah, I loved it too. Joseph has written many books. There are links in the show notes to the pages where you can buy his books. He also has a Facebook page. I think he's pretty active on Facebook. So check him out there. Follow his work there. I think you're really going to love this conversation. If you're interested in mysterious disappearances and how real disappearances sort of turn into folklore, I think you're really going to love this conversation. And it's sprinkled with history throughout. And yeah, as you mentioned, just two great guests here discussing this stuff. Lance, you and I feel like have barely done any work on this Bennington Triangle series. We just sit back and listen to these incredible storytellers. But this conversation in particular feels more like a panel than a traditional episode of Missing. But definitely let us know what you think on Spotify or YouTube.
Yeah, two quick takeaways from me. One is that I loved how Joseph Citro will always come back to earth and say, well, I'm not quite sure about that. Because that means his curiosity is always going. Even after this long, he's always endlessly curious, which I love. And also, it was amazing to hear the two of them say, well, let's talk offline and we'll exchange information. So that just leads me to believe that they're coming up with a bunch of new theories and elaborating between the two of them on what we've currently talked about. So this isn't the last time we're going to hear from them.
No, I agree. Yes, very fun stuff.
And real quick, just to remind people, we are having a virtual fundraiser for our nonprofit, Bruce Maitland's Private Investigations for the Missing. This is going to be on the Missing YouTube channel. Just go over to the live section and you'll catch a long list of great guests that are going to be appearing Tuesday, November 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can contribute whatever you can. Any little bit helps to go to a great cause.
And check out more about PIs for the Missing at investigationsforthemissing.org. Okay, so enough of this intro. Let's get to the conversation with Ross and Joseph. Please follow us on social media at MissingCSM. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow us in all those places. Share this series if you feel so inclined. And we are going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Ross and Joe Citro. Okay, we are here today with Mr. Joseph Citro. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
It is super exciting to have you on the show, Mr. Citro. Your work is incredible, but we are also joined by a previous guest of the show. He's joined us numerous times, Mr. Ross Griffiths. He's here to contribute to this conversation. We've talked about the Bennington Triangle disappearances, the mysteries there, and Joe, you have written about so many of these topics. People have listened to Ross talk about his background, so Joe, would you mind introducing yourself, and then Ross, you can follow up?
Okay, well, I've been writing professionally since about 1986. I started with a series of novels, fiction, derived from legitimate bits of Vermont history and folklore. While I was doing those, I was meeting with people and swapping stories with audiences at my readings and trying to supplement the novels with additional bits of Vermont lore and history. And I just decided at some point that there was just too much lore, too many folklore stories and legends and bits of unusual history. I'd never be able to adapt them all into novels. So in 1996, I put novels aside, having completed 5 of them, I guess, and just decided to collect the stories. So in 1994, or maybe it was 96, I don't know, I stopped writing fiction and just started collecting the stories. And the motivation here was that in the entire history of our state, our 250 plus or minus years, no single writer had ever collected and published the weird tales of Vermont. No one had ever done it. So it became sort of a sense of mission for me. And I really dug into it. My first book came out in 1994 or 96. It's just been a series of books after that. The barrel never empties. I could go on, but somebody else is going to have to catch the proverbial torch, I guess. So the Bennington Triangle, I was doing a series of commentaries on public radio. And in 1992, I did a commentary about the vanishings on Glastonbury Mountain. And in the context of that, while I was putting it together, I just came up with the term Bennington Triangle, kind of an echo of Bermuda Triangle, just a phrase that I could use to kind of unify all the strangeness on Glastonbury Mountain. So actually, I came up with the term Bennington Triangle in 1992, and it has taken flight. It's actually entered the vocabulary, I guess. So that briefly is the story.
Very cool. Yeah, it is such a wild and mysterious group of disappearances. I guess when you coined the term, did you have the idea that these cases were connected in any way beyond the location?
I had the idea that they were, but I couldn't find the connection. They were all over the place. They were locked into a 5-year period, which made them, in my mind, kind of strange. And they appeared like they were connected, but the people who vanished were, men and women, old people, young people, different ages, all in the last 3 months of the year, which gave them kind of a chilling resonance, at least in my mind. I have yet to find the connection, and I know there's been a lot of speculation since the Bennington Triangle entered the vocabulary, whatever you want to call it. A lot of people have grabbed the term. There have been a lot of podcasts, a lot of articles, a lot of speculation on YouTube and elsewhere, and a lot of things are kind of added to the story. I actually stopped researching it, and so I can't really say what's happened in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and beyond. I have a couple of additions to the story that I've never written about, but they will not shed any light on the vanishings.
And Ross, do you mind reminding the audience who you are and maybe how did you first, I know we've talked about this, but remind us again how you first heard about Joe Citro and the Bennington Triangle.
I'm Ross Griffiths. I'm a librarian, archives librarian at Worcester State University. And I first talked to you guys about a missing persons case at Worcester State, and we started talking about other missing persons cases of interest. And we mentioned the Bennington Triangle. I think that this cluster of disappearances is interesting in its own right. But what I'm curious about, one of my side interests, is folklore and kind of how does history connect with mythology, and how do people retell stories that have happened? And I think I'm familiar with Joe's work basically as books that I've read about regional history and interesting, cool, weird stuff around the New England area. And so that's how I became familiar with Joe's work. It's just my interest in these kind of local legends and the lore of New England, particularly these sort of mountainous, woodsy, sort of mysterious parts of New England.
You were talking about the history and these mysterious, weird occurrences that happen in the area. But we do have those books. I forgot what they're called, but they're like the very general historical books, the small ones. And it's, each town has one, and you see the old pictures, and it's all kind of very, very bland. I mean, it's nice. It's interesting to look at. But for both of you, and whoever wants to answer this first, but I'd love to hear from each of you. When did your love of the history of the area go from those vanilla books to, we're going to get a little weirder now? Like, I know that I know the bank, or I know that tavern used to be an old bank, but let's talk about what ghosts haunt that bank. When did that become like the crossover?
Well, that's kind of a psychoanalytical question in a way. It really started with my father when I was a little boy, and I'd ride around with him, and he would point things out to me, and like that house over there, that's haunted, supposed to be haunted, and or we would go to Cavendish, Vermont, and he would tell me the story of Phineas Gage, the railroad man that got the tamping bar blasted through his head.
Oh.
And my father, he wasn't a writer, but he was somewhat of a storyteller, and he had a head full of these local oddities, some of which were quite interesting to me because of my peculiar wiring. But he really got me started, and at some point, and again, I can't really tell you exactly the point, because I've always written written comics and little fake newspapers and stuff. All throughout school, I was writing stuff. But at some point, I decided I was just going to give it a whirl and write some novels. The novels were fiction, but in researching the fiction, I collected a lot of these bits of local lore, these folklore stories, and I became fascinated because there was such a wealth of them, and some had been collected and some hadn't, and some were well known and some weren't. And I just wanted to pull them all together and collect them into a body that would be useful to other people. I wanted to do things that would get kids charged up about history and research. And so, I would often take these stories into the schools and meet with kids and have a wonderful time. So I can't really find a trigger point for you. It's just been kind of an evolutionary thing right along. And now I'm quite old and I'm still doing it. So I guess I don't know, more to come maybe.
I think my story is similar to Joe's. I grew up in Pennsylvania in a very, very old colonial era farmhouse, and I was kind of a history nerd. So I actually spent my summer vacation when I was like 10 years old at the county courthouse going through documents. This is the era before digitization. So I always had this interest, but what I really liked is the story behind the story. So where I lived was settled back in the early 1700s, and there were lots of old houses around. And I grew up in close proximity to my grandparents, and they had all kinds of stories about, this house over there, this really unusual family lived there, and they did this wild thing, or the people over there were bootleggers back in the old days. And when I was coming of age, particularly in the later 1970s, there was the bicentennial. So there was this sort of renewed interest in local history. Lots of little local history books were published around 75, 76. And some of those books in the 70s, I think there was a resurgence in interest in folklore because some of those local history books did publish these stories. They talked to older people who were from the community, who remembered things that weren't documented. So an example of that would be there was a very old cemetery, maybe a mile or two from my house, that had been founded by Welsh settlers back in the early 1700s, including one of my distant grandfathers. And there was a story in this book that cemetery was haunted by a phantom black dog, a very large black dog that had these yellow glowing eyes. And that scared the dickens out of me as a kid. But as I got older, I learned that those black dog legends are found in many cemeteries, not just around the US, but in Great Britain. There seems to be this kind of folklore about this particular type of spirit that inhabits graveyards. And somehow that got transported across the Atlantic Ocean and settled in my little community in Pennsylvania. And I just thought that was so fascinating, that this thing that nobody really had recorded or written down until the 70s, but people had talked about for centuries, was happening right in my little corner of the world. So I'm always interested in the story behind the story, because there's always one. There's always more to it than you see in books or in newspaper articles.
Well, we've got a few of them black dogs here in Vermont too. Jesus, it's everywhere. I think you're talking about these locally published local history books, right? And some of them would record local folklore along with the history. Is that? Yeah, very cool. Yeah, that, because most of those are pretty dull, actually. But I've plowed through an awful lot of them looking for stories, and sure enough, every now and then, they never give those sorts of stories much attention, but they're there.
You had mentioned earlier Phineas Gage, and I don't think we've ever talked about this character on the show. It's a really quick story, but I'm sure some people out there were like, what did you just say? It's a really fascinating story. Can you just give us the story of Phineas Gage?
Yeah. He was a railroad man, and he was leading a crew of people building the railroad through Cavendish, Vermont, and he was about to blast some rocks. So he had drilled a hole in the rock and packed it with gunpowder, and he was tamping it down with a 6-foot tamping bar. But somehow he hit the side of the rock or something and caused a spark. The gunpowder blew. It blasted this tamping bar through his head. It went in here and out here, I think, or maybe it was this way. But anyway, it went right through his head, and oddly, it didn't kill him. Should have killed him. It did knock him down, but he never lost consciousness. The men working with him brought him to the local doctor there in Cavendish, who did a very good job of, cleaning the wound and keeping records of everything he did. Very important medical records. Phineas managed to live quite a few years after that, but it changed his personality. He was no longer Phineas. He became much more primitive and vulgar and hard to get along with, but he lived, and he's become very important to medical history, because what that proved about how the part of the brain that controls impulse can become disconnected from the rest of the brain. I'm not sure if I know the neurological terms, but anyway, they occasionally will host gatherings of medical people there in Cavendish and walk them down to where the incident happened. They have a lot of information in the Cavendish History Museum about Phineas. But Phineas himself, his skull and his tamping bar are in a museum in Boston, where you can visit it and actually see pictures of him and the bar. My father told the story, but of course my father got it wrong. He thought the bar had blasted through Phineas's head like this, and kind of like Steve Martin's arrow, and that the doctor had simply cut it off on both ends because he didn't dare yank it out. My father got that wrong, but he got me interested in this story, so I went back and checked it out, and yeah, that's Phineas. Is that essentially what you remember, Ross?
I think I remember the story, and I think I've seen the pictures of Phineas Gage. That he was famous for having this very grotesque injury. And that they were interested in the way it changed his personality.
Yeah.
So it became this kind of medical marvel. But a lot of the contemporary accounts of Phineas Gage have this very kind of circus sideshow feel to it. Like today, we're more, I think, a little more clinical about it, a little bit more curious. And back then it was sort of this sideshow spectacle of this man with the iron bar in his head. And there's a tone, I think, if you go back and read those old sources, that I think today we'd find very distasteful and a little bit mean-spirited in some cases, that this man had suffered this terrible tragedy. But it really is a remarkable story considering the medical capacities of the day that this guy survived at all.
He did tour for a while with carnivals, and he ended with his camping bar. And just in the last few years, I'd say within the last decade, an actual photograph of him post-injury has turned up. And you can see where it destroyed one of his eyes. He's only got one eye, and no damage to the camping bar.
That's good. That's good to know. And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Right. Now, I want to revisit just something that you had mentioned, Ross and Joe, about this sighting of a big cat. Did you say you actually had a sighting of a big cat in a cemetery, or you heard about them?
A dog, and I didn't have a sighting. This was recorded in one of our local history books around the bicentennial period, and they had collected some local folklore, and they would make a little mention of it. But there was this legend of a phantom black dog, and the glowing yellow or glowing orange eyes seem to be this feature of these phantom dogs. And it is and like I said, as a kid, scared me. As an adult, I learned this is a figure. This is a kind of sighting that's recorded in folklore all around the United States, all around parts of Europe, maybe other places as well. So it was interesting to see that bigger connection. But no, I've never seen anything like that. I don't want to see anything. I don't want to see anything like that.
Now, Joe, have you ever had a sighting like that?
No. The closest I came was I saw a catamount, and it was a big cat, a giant cat, a mountain lion, and they're not supposed to be here. Supposedly the last one in Vermont was killed in 1886 or something like that in the town of Barnard. But I saw one when I was driving up 91 one day, and it was an unambiguous sighting because it was crossing the interstate, and I was in a car, and I was getting closer and closer to it. And so if there was some ambiguity at first, there was less as I got closer. I could see it. It was very much feline. It had a very long tail extended behind it. And it was very casual in the way it walked across the highway. It didn't pick, it somehow must have been able to compute that this giant metal monster rushing toward it wasn't going to reach it. So it didn't have to hurry. It just kind of ambled off the side of the highway, leapt over the guardrails and vanished into the pucker brush. But there were two of us in the car. It was an unambiguous sighting. It was really there. And I've never for a minute thought they were spectral. I think they're there. They maybe they don't live in Vermont. Maybe they just crossed through Vermont on the way to the tax-free malls in New Hampshire or something. But they are here from time to time. I saw one, and I can't be ridiculed out of it. It was there. I do suspect a conspiracy, however, having to do with the catamounts. I don't know this. I can't prove this, but I really think the state fish and game department knows they're here, knows where they are, and simply doesn't want to make it public because, every Yahoo with a rifle would be out looking for them. So, but there's nothing spooky about that. It was actually quite wonderful.
Let's explore a little bit more of this conspiracy. Okay, I understand why the fish and game and wildlife people would want hunters to go in to try to capture one of these things and, mount it on their wall. How did they discover them? Do they have them? Do they have like one or two in captivity themselves? How did those cats get on their radar?
Well, people report the sightings, and And in some cases, the game wardens will go out and investigate and check for scat and paw prints and scratch marks on trees and things like that. It happens frequently enough, I suspect, so that there's some awareness within the department that people are actually seeing them. What I don't understand is that they have been in the habit of trying to explain them away, say there's something else, say they're bobcats or something like that. But anyone who's grown up in the woods, near the woods, or in these rural communities knows what a bobcat is. They know it has just a little bit of a little tiny tail, where these things have a tail as long as their bodies. So that's how I think they become aware that they're here. But the conspiracy is simply that my own paranoia about how much they know. I suspect they've investigated these enough, and they have enough people in the woods so that if there's a population of these guys living under some rock somewhere, they'd know it. They'd know that they're living here somewhere. I know where I've visited the spot where not the last, but the next to last catamount was killed. It's not too far from where I live. And you can go there and you can see this cave where it lived. And the state's full of similar caves. There could be a bunch of cats out there. Who knows? They either know and they're not telling, which makes it a conspiracy, or they don't know.
Right.
Who knows?
But you saw one. You're an eyewitness yourself. Now, I noticed in your books, you've written a lot about hauntings and ghosts and things like that. Have you ever had a sighting or a paranormal experience?
That's sort of tough. I've had a few kind of weird things happen, but they're not very dramatic. I once spent the night in an allegedly haunted inn all by myself. I was the only one in there. I heard some stuff. It sounded like heavy boxes being pushed around in the room above where I was trying to sleep. And that was weird. It was loud and somewhat scary. And I had an experience that I'd never experienced before, and that is that I suddenly became very frightened. If the evening had progressed the way I wish it had, I would have rushed out of my room and rushed upstairs and tried to identify what was making the noise. I mean, it was, if you can picture the sound of, let's say, a heavy chest or crate being pushed across a gritty wooden floor. That's the sound I was hearing, and I heard it repeatedly upstairs. Now, mind you, I was the only person in the inn. They let me stay there because they closed the inn for 2 weeks while they were shifting from foliage season to snow season. They closed, everybody went home. But I knew the owner, so he let me stay there. Next day, somebody came to let me out of the inn, and I told her about it. I told her what I had heard. And we went upstairs, and there wasn't another guest room upstairs. What there was a little closet with a 3-foot-high door that opened into an attic space. And we went out there, and sure enough, the gritty wooden floor in that attic space was full of crates. So, and they were too big. I mean, it couldn't have been a mouse, a rat, or a squirrel pushing these things around. Those things had been moving, and there was nobody up there to move them. That's not too scary, but that's the weirdest thing that's happened to me. You want to hear this?
Please.
This is again. It's. I was living alone in an apartment in Burlington, Vermont, downtown Burlington, and I heard this high-pitched whining sound. So I figured it was probably a smoke alarm, but it wasn't. And then I thought maybe it was a car alarm because this house was right on the street. So I walked across the living room and looked out the windows, and there were no no car alarms blasting. But as I got closer to the window, I could tell that the sound was coming from my right. And to my right was the kitchen. So the sound was coming from the kitchen. I walked out into the kitchen. I'm not very tidy. I had left a lot of dirty dishes on the countertop. And one of them was a glass. Now, this is weird. This glass was spinning. And it was spinning real fast. And it was either spinning because of the noise or the glass was making the noise. I think it was the latter. And while I was watching that glass in my kitchen, it exploded. And it blew little cubes of glass all over the kitchen. I was finding them for days afterward. I remember that vividly. I saw it. I was awake while it was happening. Some people have called it the Oz factor, that you sort of behave irrationally in the presence of peculiar events. If I had been thinking clearly, I would have collected the pieces and put them in a baggie and recorded everything. I didn't. I just swept them up and threw them away and walked away puzzled. And to this day, I can't imagine what caused that. My neighbor, who lived in the next house over, with whom I was very good friends, is a scientist, and he works at the university in Plattsburgh. And I told him about it, and I might not have told just anybody, but this guy knows me enough to realize I'm not crazy and I'm not going to report false information. And he had a very interesting answer. He said that, this kind of a thing happens, but you can't get it to repeat. The scientific method requires that we get things to repeat, and otherwise we can't study them. So, yeah, he accepted the story as true, but neither of us could come up with any kind of an explanation. I'm not quick to leap to a ghost explanation. It was I don't know what it was. Ross, perhaps you can tell me.
Well, yeah, I saw Ross kind of thinking about it there, so I'm curious to hear what your opinion is on this. Have you ever heard anything like that?
Science is outside my pay grade, but I will say that I wonder about some kind of temperature. Was there a radiator underneath the glass area? Was there heat? Because I'm wondering if there's heat, and that's all I can think of. But I don't know. I don't know physics.
There was no radiator in the kitchen. The burners were all off. There was a dishwasher, and it would have been on top of the dishwasher, and the dishwasher would have given off heat had it been on, but all the dirty dishes were still on the countertop. I've never got very far. I've told that story a few times in hopes of hearing similar stories, but I've heard stories about glasses and dishes flying off shelves and flying off across the room and things like that, but nothing spinning. And here's the other thing. I didn't know I was going to be telling this story because I have an identical glass that didn't break, that I still have, and I would be showing it to you now. It's not this one, but the point is, you can't spin them. You can't get them to spin like that.
So it was spinning while it was up, not on its side, on its bottom.
Yeah. How can I show you? I can show you and use my book as the countertop. This glass was not like this, but like this.
Oh,
spinning.
So tilted.
Yeah.
Oh, and spinning kind of on as if an invisible axis was in the middle and it was tilted around it.
Very well said. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's never happened to me.
No.
Was it almost as if someone had, if there had, let's say there had been a person in the room, if somebody had spun the glass really fast, and it wouldn't have been something like that?
I tried to do it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't get the glass to spin. It was going really fast.
Huh.
Where did this happen?
In Bennington, Vermont. I owned a house up there,
And then you sold the house immediately after.
Not immediately, but nothing.
I would have been on Zillow right away.
Nothing like that ever happened in the house before or after. I lived there for quite a while. I lived there for 20 years, and that was the only thing that ever happened weird in that house. In fact, it wasn't sufficiently weird, so I didn't reveal it when I was selling the house. I didn't say, "Oh yeah, and once a glass."
Yeah, it's not like you found a dead body.
Yeah, if there were a ghost or something, if there
Yeah.
were repeated reports of a ghost in that house, I would have had to reveal it at the closing, but I didn't. I didn't think that was sufficiently weird.
Yeah. Now, what is your favorite topic to write about?
Well, that's a good question. I like writing about ghosts because, or at least ghost stories. There are a lot of ghost stories that are not very interesting, but many of them are really interesting, and they reveal a lot about the history of the state or the history of a family or something like that. I did a whole book of Vermont Ghost Guide, which is a collection of lots of Vermont ghost stories. They're fun. They're fun to write about. Right now, I've sort of gotten out of the supernatural and fiction realm, and I'm writing a book about the Vermont State Prison. Which is which is in walking distance from my house, and I was walking by it pretty regularly, and then one day I stopped and I thought, well, geez, I wonder how many executions have taken place here, and I started looking into that and thought, well, that might make an interesting book. The stories of all the executions that have taken place since Vermont has been an entity. I don't want to cause any dead air by asking you to guess how many you think there might have been. There have been 26 in the history of the whole state, and that's few enough to research and write about, so I wanted to do that. Interestingly, many of the murderers I confronted earlier as I was researching ghost stories. So it all kind of ties together.
You wrote about them in the context of there being a ghost story because of the murder?
Yeah. And now I'm meeting those same people again, incarcerated in the prison, about to be hanged. Here in Vermont, we didn't go in for any of the more exotic forms of execution, like firing squads and lethal injections. Here it was just hanging or electrocution. And the last electrocution was in 1954. They became illegal in 1972, so it was quite a stretch without any executions, and I'm pretty happy about that. I'm anti-capital punishment. I'm very much against it for two reasons. One is that I just think it's wrong, and two, I think there's a danger of doing it, getting the wrong person, executing the wrong person. I think there's a big chance of that. So plus, I suppose life in prison is a much worse punishment in some ways. But I want to look at these stories and see if we've ever executed the wrong people. So I'm going to tell 26 stories, starting way back when, in 1700s.
That's super cool. That's a great idea for a book.
And in your work on this, have you discovered or come across any of the people who were executed to be possibly not guilty of the crimes that they were executed for?
Not yet. I mean, the very first one that I'm writing about is sort of ambiguous because it happened during the Revolution, and during that period, during that 14-year period when Vermont was an independent republic. So the guy was executed for treason. So because he was loyal to the crown rather than to the colonists. So yeah, he might have been guilty of treason, but
hardly executionable.
It's kind of hard to parse whether he should have been executed. Anyway, I'll have more information if we talk again. I'm just getting my feet wet with this book.
Cool. Yeah, I would love to hear about that when you have, more of it down on paper.
It's my winter project.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on, getting back to the Bennington Triangle, the concept of this lost horizon. And it would be really interesting to hear how both of you kind of interpret that.
I think it was the best way that they had back in 1950 to talk about the sort of weird factor. Today we have these words like the triangle concept or the concept, they're sort of popularly recognized. But back around 1950, when they started talking about the lost horizon, that's where I think that's what they were able to reach to within popular culture that most people don't understand. This idea of Shangri-La, this idea of some sort of mystical place that draws people away from their normal lives and maybe they don't come back. And so I think it represents communicating some kind of ineffable idea of mystery, but not quite sure what's going on, but they don't want to say they don't want to name it. And that was as close as they could get.
Well, some of the reporting at the time of the disappearances used that lost horizon notion to describe it, and I can't tell. It's been a while since I've read those articles, but I can't tell if they were using it to, just to emphasize a point, the way I was when I said Bennington Triangle, or if they were being serious and they really thought there might be some realm into which people vanished. I would have to go back and take a look at that. But you're right. That term was being used at the time of the vanishing. There was no speculation ever about like UFO abductions or anything like that. There was no speculation at the time about Bigfoot or big hairy creatures. That area had been known to host monsters. There was something called the Bennington Monster that was just talked about for years. I discovered that there was a person back in the early 50s, late 40s, who was collecting stories about the so-called Bennington Monster. And I made an effort to try to track down that person, dead, and what happened to this file, this collection of stories about the Bennington Monster, because I was sort of interested what kind of a monster it was, and that wasn't made clear in any of the articles I read. I was dipping back into the files of the Green Mountain Folklore Society and trying to find that out. And was it a Tyrannosaurus Rex or was it a Bigfoot or what the hell was it? The notion of Bigfoot has been sort of alive in that area. There've been a lot of Bigfoot reports from that area. So that enters the picture. There's a lot of people who insist that that's what happened to those people. They were snatched by Bigfoots. I don't know. I don't know if that's the answer, but it's interesting. This guy that I can't remember his name, but he's the guy that tracks disappearances all over the country, mostly those that focus in national parks.
He's David Paulides.
Yeah, that's the guy. And then a while ago, I looked him up on the web, and he had two separate areas of study. One was Bigfoot, and one was disappearances, but no crossover. It was quite strange. One wonders how he explains the disappearances. I don't even know if he ever covered the Bennington story. I'm not sure.
I don't know that he's covered a lot in the Northeast. I'll have to take a look and see, because I've heard him interviewed on various podcasts. But here's back to the Lost Horizon. What's interesting is when that term starts getting used, there is the article, which you probably saw years ago, Joe, where the paper is saying, that's around the time Frida Langer disappeared. It was sort of toward the end of this process. The sort of a headline, is there a lost horizon in Bennington or in Vermont? And the article states, the police shot down the idea that anything weird was happening. There's nothing weird happening here. There's a logical explanation behind all of these. We just don't know what it is yet. So you sort of had you had journalists introducing this idea of something maybe not otherworldly. They didn't quite want to go that far back then, but the police shooting it down and saying, everybody relax. These are all natural disappearances. It's either foul play or someone walked off in the woods. So there was debate about this. But here's an interesting detail, and I think I mentioned this in the Weldon case. There was a little cottage along that stretch of long trail where people had their vacation houses and their hunting cabins. And that cottage was called Shangri-La. It had a little name tag on it. And that was one of the cottages that they were interested in searching when they were looking for Paula Weldon. So I thought that was kind of an interesting little crossover that I wonder, did people spontaneously come up with this idea of the Lost Horizon, or was some journalist out there tracking the investigation, saw that cabin called Shangri-La and a light bulb went off and said, this is like that. And that sort of introduced the idea. I think it's a very interesting little connection.
It's a wonderful detail. I'll tell you something kind of interesting, that after I did this research and after I was publishing these, I published stories about the Bennington Triangle in 2 or 3 different books. And afterwards, twice, I was approached by these so-called cold case investigators. These guys they didn't know each other. They approached me at different times, but they were both retired military investigators. And now they were retired. They didn't have anything to do, so they're looking for things to investigate. And I can make this sound really creepy, but I won't. It's one of them. I met with him and gave him all the information I had, and we chatted and had a nice chat. And he sort of disappeared. and he had killed himself. This is not part of the mystery. I mean, this is his internal struggle. He was looking for some way to use his time, and that happened. So I can make that sound weird. It's not weird. It's tragic, and it's not part of the process. The other guy, who was slightly more aggressive, kept in touch with me for quite a while, and he was doing some serious work, but he didn't disclose everything he was doing. And then he said, he either emailed me or called me one day and said, I know where Paula Weldon is. I found her. She's in the trunk of a car, and the car is buried near where there used to be a cabin on the Long Trail. He was very emphatic. He'd found her. He knew where she was. And he wanted to organize this big event for the press, and he wanted me to be there and to cover it. And I was sort of excited. I mean, we all suspect, particularly with Paula Weldon, we suspect foul play. And then he too disappeared. There was never any follow-up to this dramatic revelation. I waited a while. I never heard from him. I tried the phone number I had, didn't work anymore. The emails either didn't go through, or he wasn't answering them, or whatever. It just dropped out of sight. Earlier this year, I was telling this story to a British newspaper that was quite interested in the disappearances. The reporter wondered what this guy's name was, and I couldn't remember, so I said, let me get back to you. So I did a web search, and sure enough, he too had died. And I can make that sound weird, but I'm sure that's just the natural progress of things. But the possibility that he really had located her body still kind of resonates with me. It makes me a little uneasy. But then again, at the time of the vanishings, all sorts of people were revealing all sorts of things. They were even using psychics. There was a woman from Pownell, Vermont, who had helped with the Lindbergh case, and she also weighed in on, I think, the Paula Weldon case. There were a lot of revelations and a lot of information, but just we don't know what happened to Paula. There's an interesting bit of new information that has been introduced. Somebody decided to start saying that all the people who had disappeared in the triangle area were wearing red. that doesn't check. And it's not true.
That's a David Paulides creation, as far as I know.
He must have looked at that story then.
Either that or other people kind of projected that
Yeah.
onto that then. Yeah.
There's an interesting folklore connection to this, though, or at least maybe not folklore, but the idea of the story behind the story. The Weldon case, I think, is so interesting, partly because we know so much about her because some of the police files survived and other historians have talked about this. So we can get a grasp of her personality and sort of what she was like as a person, which we don't have as much with some of these other people. Frida Langer, some. But here was the interesting thing. There was a little tidbit that came up in the Weldon investigation. A woman in Woodford, Vermont, approached police and said that she'd had a dream that Paula Weldon was buried under the floorboards of a house and a stove was sitting on top of the grave. Now, that's very interesting to me because on one hand, was she claiming a psychic dream? What does that mean? But what that suggests to me is, was she hearing rumors? What were people talking about? This is a small village, and that's the stuff that doesn't get recorded. The newspapers might pick up on little bits of that, but there must have been a lot of talk about that lumberjack and about Paula and about what he might have done to her. And I'm wondering if that woman's dream, quote unquote, was her way of telling the police a rumor that she'd heard. That she, and this is where I think hearsay and gossip and those kinds of stories that fly below the radar are really important, because I think there's a lot of information. If we could have been a fly on the wall for some of those conversations, we might have a very different sense about any one of these cases, particularly the Weldon case.
Yeah, there's a lot of there was a lot of information collected, and a lot of it was sort of semi supernatural information or rumors or whatever. There were even some confessions, as I recall, which were quickly discounted. But we don't know. And I think you probably know, Ross, that the Vermont State Police didn't exist at that time, but it was the Paula Weldon case that was pivotal and caused the Vermont State Police to be organized. We didn't have a statewide police force at that time. We just had this one investigator named Elmo Franzoni who went around the whole state, and he was working on that case. He was from Rutland, I think. He was the only one, and I'm not sure how useful it would be to go back and look at the police files. I've been curious to do that, but I never have tried to pull them all together or access them. They may not even exist anymore.
The files that do exist were really useful because they included extensive interviews with Paula's roommate. And the roommate, of course, they were good friends. They went camping together. So she had all these stories she told about Paula, and you can really kind of build a sense of Paula's personality from that. And it gives her a lot of dimension. Incidentally, about police records, for these talks I've had on this podcast, I made a lot of phone calls to different police agencies around Vermont. And the only records that I think still exist, at least as far as I can tell, is that group of Paula Weldon files. Every other place I called said, yeah, we don't have records going back that far, or I'll take a look in our vault and get back to you. But I think that unfortunately, a lot of the granular information or witness interviews or those kinds of things that we might use to sort of get a more well-rounded picture of these cases, I think unfortunately a lot of that's lost to time.
Ross, if you contact me privately after this, I can probably get you some information about a state cop, a Vermont state cop. He may be retired now, but he took a particular interest in this case and did a lot of independent investigation. And so far, he hasn't disappeared. I think I can get you that information. If this is something you're still looking into, he'd probably be a good one to talk to.
Very cool. Now, Joe, we're coming up here on the hour, but I'm curious, are there any other of the disappearances in the Bennington Triangle that you suspect are foul play?
There's stories about each one of them, and some of the stories suggest foul play. Particularly the one about the little boy, Paul Jepson. There was a lot local scuttlebutt about his parents and that they might have been responsible for his disappearance. I haven't been convinced that may be so. I don't know. I think Mitty Rivers just vanished. That was the first one. He was 70. He was about my age, I guess, and he was leading some people into the woods, and he got a little bit ahead of them, and they never caught up with him, and they never found him. But he was a practiced woodsman. He knew the mountain, and he just vanished. And it was somewhat touching. After my first book came out, in which I told these stories, I got a letter from Mitty Rivers' family, and they were thanking me for just remembering him and keeping the memory alive. That was back in 1994, plus or minus, or plus 94, 95. I wonder how they feel now. The story has just been blasted. I mean, we've just been pummeled by paranormal programming. There's just such a proliferation of paranormal programming in every media, and this comes up a lot. So I don't know. I hope they're still happy with it. The kind of publicity Mitty Rivers is getting. None of it has been disparaging, of course. It just remains the first vanishing. And some of the vanishings are somewhat questionable. I know some people like to add a guy named Herrick, who was a hunter who vanished sometime before Mitty Rivers. But they found him. They found his body, and it had been crushed. And so the Bigfoot contingent steps in and said, "Oh well, Bigfoot must have crushed him, but it was probably a bear." I've read the autopsy notes. It was pretty certain a bear crushed him. but do you add that? I don't add that. He didn't disappear. He died in the woods, as many hunters do. So, and this, there've been some after that, but the core 5 vanishings is enough to keep my imagination alive here and wonder what's going on up there.
Wow. Well, Mr. Citro and Ross, this has been a really great conversation. Kind of feels like a panel. Really, really fun stuff chatting with both of you about these cases. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you both so much for joining.
Thank you.
And might I say, sort of a dream team of people who are experts in this topic, in this area, this region. So kind of cool and surreal to see you both on the screen at the same time.